The rain was relentless that night. Thick sheets of water poured from the sky, turning the streets into shimmering rivers of light as neon reflections danced across the wet pavement. Ethan Calloway, a self-made millionaire, sat in the back seat of his black luxury sedan, rubbing his temples as the city blurred past him. Another long day, another series of meetings, another deal closed. He should have been happy. He had everything: wealth, power, influence. The kind of life most people dreamed of. Yet, as he sat in the silence of his car, feeling the rhythmic pitter-patter of the rain against the windows, he felt empty. Success had filled his bank account, but it had hollowed him out inside. The car slowed as they approached an intersection, the red light reflecting off the slick streets. Ethan barely paid attention. Just another stop before he was taken back to his penthouse, where he would drink alone and fall asleep in yet another cold, empty bed. But then, something caught his eye. A figure, hunched over, barely visible beneath a flickering street lamp. At first, he thought it was just another homeless person, curled up against the cold. A common sight in the city, people Ethan had learned to ignore. But then he saw her arms wrapped around something small. A baby. The woman sat on the pavement, drenched, her thin dress clinging to her fragile frame. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands over her pale face. But she wasn't focused on herself. She was clutching the baby against her chest, her body acting as the only barrier between the infant and the storm. Ethan's breath hitched. She wasn't begging. She wasn't looking around for help. She just held the child as if nothing else in the world mattered. The baby wasn't even crying. Too weak. Maybe? Too cold? His pulse quickened. The light turned green. The driver pressed the gas lightly, but Ethan's voice cut through the air. "Stop the car." The driver hesitated. "Sir, just stop." The car rolled to a halt by the curb. Ethan barely registered the rain as he stepped out, the icy water soaking through his expensive suit in seconds. He crossed the street toward the woman, hands raised slightly, not wanting to scare her. She looked up immediately, her wide, fear-filled eyes locking onto him. Ethan slowed. Her face was gaunt, her skin almost ghostly pale under the dim street lamp. She looked as if she hadn't eaten in days. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "Are you okay?" The woman clutched the baby tighter. "We have nowhere to go," she whispered. Her voice barely carried over the rain, but Ethan heard the desperation in it, the quiet resignation. A chill ran through him. He had walked past dozens of homeless people in his life, handed out the occasional bill, donated to shelters. But this was different. He had never seen a woman holding a child out in the rain. His gut twisted. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. The woman didn't answer right away. She glanced down at the baby, her lips trembling. "Too long," she whispered. Ethan looked down at the child. It was wrapped in an old, threadbare blanket, soaked from the rain, barely moving. His heart clenched. He had to do something. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against his wallet. But money wouldn't fix this. Then his fingers closed around something solid and cold. His house keys. Without thinking, he pulled them out and held them toward her. "Take these." The woman's eyes widened. What? "There's a house a few blocks from here. It's mine, but no one is staying there right now. Take the keys. Get out of the rain. Get warm." The woman stared at him, stunned. "Why?" she whispered. Ethan hesitated. Why was he doing this? He had never done something like this before. He had never even considered it. But something deep inside him told him it was the right thing to do. "Because I can," he said simply. A single tear slid down the woman's cheek, mixing with the rain. Her hands trembled as she reached out and took the keys. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "There's food inside. Clean clothes. Stay as long as you need." The woman cradled the baby close, nodding frantically as if she couldn't believe what was happening. She took one last look at him before turning, hurrying toward the direction of the house. Ethan stood there, watching her disappear into the rain. For the first time in years, he felt like he had done something that mattered. But what he didn't know was that this was only the beginning, because when he returned to his house a week later, expecting to find a grateful woman and child, what he found instead left him utterly speechless. It had been a week since Ethan had given the woman the keys to his townhouse. He hadn't thought much about it after that night. At first, he had considered checking in on her sooner, but something stopped him. Maybe he didn't want to ruin the one good thing he had done in a long time. Or maybe, deep down, he had been afraid that when he arrived, the house would be empty, the woman long gone, the keys abandoned on the kitchen counter. Just another reminder that good deeds didn't always lead to good endings. But today, for some reason, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. And so, as his driver pulled up in front of the townhouse, Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The house looked normal. The lights were on. Nothing seemed out of place. But the moment he stepped onto the porch, he knew something was wrong. The first thing he noticed was the lack of hesitation. If the woman had truly been a beggar, desperate, scared, and used to luxury, he expected to see signs of someone struggling to adjust. Instead, everything was too perfect. The front porch had been cleaned. The doormat, which had been crooked for weeks, was now perfectly aligned. The lock had been tampered with. Nothing obvious, but someone had messed with the keyhole, as if testing if another key worked. A security camera he had installed months ago had been removed. The screws still lay on the ground near the door. Ethan's heart pounded. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a woman grateful for shelter. Something else was happening here. His grip tightened around his key as he pushed the door open. The interior was spotless. The floors had been swept, the air smelled clean, and everything was in its place, except for one thing. His personal belongings were gone. His watch collection, gone. His expensive laptop and phone chargers, gone. Even the framed photos that had once sat on the fireplace mantel, gone. It was as if the house had been stripped of everything personal. But the woman's belongings? Neatly placed, organized, like she had been living there for years, like it had always been her home. Ethan's pulse quickened. He moved through the house carefully, checking each room, expecting to find signs of a struggle. A mess, clothes tossed about, any indication that this woman was barely surviving. Instead, he found a crib, a brand new crib sitting in the middle of what had once been his office. His throat tightened. That hadn't been there before. He moved closer. The crib was immaculate, decorated with soft blankets and tiny stuffed animals. And there, tucked inside, was the baby, sleeping peacefully, like it had been living here all along. Ethan exhaled sharply. He turned toward the hallway, toward the master bedroom, his mind racing. That's when he heard it. The soft sound of running water. Someone was in the shower. She was still here. Ethan wasn't sure why his hands were shaking as he stepped toward the bedroom door. He should have felt relief that she hadn't run off with all his things. Instead, he felt uneasy. This wasn't just a struggling woman trying to survive. This was something else entirely. The door to the master bathroom was ajar, steam curling out from inside. He pushed it open. The woman stood in front of the mirror, wrapped in one of his robes, her damp hair clinging to her shoulders. She wasn't startled. She didn't scream or stumble back in shock. She simply turned to look at him, calm as ever, like she had been expecting him. "You're back," she said, smiling slightly. Ethan stared at her. "What the hell is going on here?" She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "My house," he snapped. "My things. Where are they?" She tilted her head. "I cleaned up. You said I could stay here." Ethan's blood boiled. "That doesn't explain why my belongings are missing." Her smile didn't waver. "They didn't belong here," she said simply. His stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" She took a step toward him. "I mean, Ethan," she said softly. "This house was never yours to begin with." His breath caught. He felt the weight of her words before he even fully understood them. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. The woman's smile grew. And that's when she said something that changed everything. "I lived here long before you ever did." Ethan felt like the ground had just vanished beneath him. Lived here before? That was impossible. He had bought this house years ago. It was his, fair and square. And yet, as he looked into the woman's calm, knowing eyes, something in his gut told him. She wasn't lying. Ethan's mind raced. She lived here before? That was impossible. He had bought this house years ago. He had signed the papers, legally owned it. And yet, the woman standing in front of him, wrapped in his robe, her wet hair dripping onto the hardwood floor, looked completely at home, as if she had always belonged here. Ethan took a step back, his pulse pounding. He needed to think. He needed to process. Instead, his eyes moved around the room, and that's when he saw it. His belongings? Gone. In their place. Her things. His leather chair, the one he used to sit in while reading, replaced with an old rocking chair. His sleek, modern dresser? Gone. Now a vintage wooden one stood in its place. The artwork he had hung on the walls? Vanished. In their place there were family photos. Not his family. Hers. His heart clenched. He walked toward the nightstand, his fingers brushing over an old, black and white photo. It was of a man, a woman, and a baby. The woman in the picture was her. He looked up at her sharply. "Who are you?" She smiled. "I already told you. I lived here before you did." Ethan's grip on the photo tightened. "That's impossible. I bought this house. It was empty when I moved in." Her expression didn't change. No, it wasn't. His stomach twisted. Was she messing with him? Playing games? He turned on his heel and stormed out of the bedroom, heading toward his study. If this woman was trying to scam him, if she had somehow planted herself here and made him think he was losing his mind, he would find proof. But when he opened the door to the study, his entire body went cold. The study wasn't his anymore. The sleek, modern desk he had custom ordered? Gone. The bookshelves filled with legal documents and business contracts? Replaced with dusty old books. But the worst part? The walls. Where he had once hung minimalist art, there were now framed newspaper clippings. Dozens of them. All old, yellowed with time, covering almost every inch of the walls. Ethan swallowed hard and stepped forward, his eyes darting over the headlines. And then his blood ran cold. Local woman and child vanish without a trace, 1987. His breathing grew shallow as he scanned the next one. Husband returns home to find family missing, townhouse left untouched. And then the final one. The one that made his heart nearly stop. Man sells house after losing wife and child, unable to stay in empty home. Ethan's hands shook. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting the woman's. She was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching him. "I told you," she said softly. "This was never your house." Ethan struggled to breathe. His mind couldn't keep up. This had to be a lie. A prank. A trick. Something. "That doesn't make sense," he said, shaking his head. "The house was empty when I bought it." The woman stepped inside, her gaze steady. "Was it?" Ethan clenched his fists. "Yes, it was. Wasn't it?" Suddenly, his own memories felt hazy. Had the house really been as empty as he remembered? Had he ever questioned the creaky floorboards, the old furniture left behind in the attic, the feeling that he was never really alone? No, he had ignored it, because he had been too focused on work, too busy to care. And now, it was all coming back. A sudden thought hit him like a freight train. He turned sharply. The baby. The woman's face darkened. What about him? Ethan's pulse raced. "That night, when I found you on the street. That baby." She held up a hand. "Stop." He ignored her. "Where did he come from?" She stared at him, unblinking. And then, finally, she answered. "The same place I did." Ethan took a step back, his breathing uneven. "What does that even mean?" he demanded. She sighed. "You still don't get it, do you?" "Get what?" She took another step closer. "This house isn't yours. You already said that. But you don't understand why." Ethan gritted his teeth. "Then explain it." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said something that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. "You gave the keys to a woman and child in the rain, Ethan. He felt a shiver crawl up his spine. So? Her voice was almost a whisper. Did you ever stop to wonder why the baby never cried? The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. The baby hadn't cried. Not once. Not in the rain. Not in the warmth of the house. Not in the crib. A chill ran through his entire body. You're lying, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman just smiled. Am I? And then, in the silence of the house, Ethan heard something that made his blood run cold. A soft, faint sound. Not a cry, not a breath, but a whisper, a child's whisper, coming from behind him. Ethan's blood ran cold. The whisper came from behind him. Soft, faint, barely audible. His muscles locked, his breath shallow. He didn't want to turn around. He didn't want to see. But something deep inside him, some instinct, some unshakable force, compelled him to. Slowly, with every nerve in his body screaming in protest, he turned his head, and what he saw nearly made his heart stop. A child stood in the doorway, no older than 3, dressed in pale, old-fashioned clothing. His tiny hands clutched the railing, his dark eyes wide, unblinking. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. The baby, the same baby from that rainy night. But he was older now. Too old. He had aged years in just a week. Ethan stumbled back, his pulse hammering in his ears. What is this? He gasped. The woman sighed. You're finally seeing, she said softly. Ethan shook his head violently. This isn't real. This isn't. But then the child moved. Not in a normal, clumsy toddler way. His movements were too smooth, too precise. Like something that had practiced being human. Ethan's entire body went ice cold. I gave you shelter, he whispered, looking at the woman now. I helped you. You did, she said, smiling faintly. But that doesn't change what's already been done. Ethan's chest tightened. Who are you? Her expression softened. You already know, she said, and deep down he did. The photos on the walls. The newspaper clippings, the missing belongings, replaced with hers. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a scam. The woman in front of him had lived in this house long before he had. And the baby had never been alive. Ethan's mind felt like it was fracturing. He turned back toward the child. The boy stared at him, unmoving, unblinking. The light from the hallway flickered, and suddenly memories surfaced. Memories that weren't his. Flashes of this very house decades ago. A man, a husband, kissing his wife in the kitchen. A baby's laughter filling the hallways. Love, warmth, family. Until one night. A rainy night. A night just like the one Ethan had found them in. Except this time, the man hadn't saved them. He had left. Forgotten. And by the time he returned, they were gone. Or rather, they had never truly left. Ethan's breath was ragged. You're not real. The woman's face remained calm. Does it matter? The baby, the child, tilted his head, as if studying him. Then he smiled. And suddenly Ethan understood. This wasn't just some haunting. This wasn't just a tragic past clinging to the present. It was a loop, a cycle that had played out before. One that had almost happened again. Until Ethan had done what the man from the past never did. He had saved them. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then the woman reached out. Ethan flinched, but she didn't touch him. She only smiled. You gave us a home again, she whispered. And just like that, the child was gone. The woman vanished. And the house was his once more. Ethan stood frozen in the middle of the room, his breath uneven. The woman and child gone. No fading, no slow disappearance, just gone. As if they had never been there. But the weight of their presence still lingered. The air felt different, lighter, but also emptier. For a long time, Ethan just stood there, trying to make sense of it all. Had he imagined everything? Had he lost his mind? But then he turned to the wall, where the newspaper clippings had been. They were gone too. All except one. A single, yellowed article remained, pinned to the wall like a reminder. Ethan stepped forward, his hands slightly shaking as he read. Local woman and child vanish without a trace, 1987. Husband returns home to find house untouched, except for the crib. His stomach clenched. He read on, his eyes darting over the words. The woman's name, Lillian Harper. Her child's name, Nathan Harper. And then the husband's name. Ethan stumbled back, because it was a name he recognized. Not from newspapers, not from history, from his own life. His grandfather's name. His heart pounded. This wasn't just some haunting. This was his past. His own family's past. He read the article again, more carefully this time. It all came together like a cruel puzzle. His grandfather, James Calloway, had once lived in this very house, had once been married to Lillian Harper, had once had a son. But one night, during a storm, he left them behind. And when he returned, they were gone. Ethan's fingers clenched around the paper. His grandfather had never talked about his past, never mentioned a wife, a child. And now Ethan knew why. Because he had abandoned them, because he had lost them, and because somehow they had never truly left. Ethan felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had spent his entire life chasing success, throwing himself into work, avoiding emotions, just like his grandfather had. And now, he had almost repeated history. He had almost driven past that night, almost left the woman and child to vanish again. But he hadn't. For the first time, someone in his family had chosen differently. He had chosen to stop, to help, to give them shelter. And in doing so, he had broken the cycle. He had given them the peace they had been waiting for. Ethan took a deep breath. For the first time, the house felt like his. No more shadows. No more whispers. Just silence. Not the kind of cold emptiness that had followed him his whole life, but a silence filled with understanding, with closure, with peace. And as he stood there, staring at the faded newspaper in his hands, he made a promise. He would never become the man his grandfather was. He would never walk away from the people who needed him. Because now he understood, some things are more important than wealth. And sometimes, a single act of kindness can rewrite an entire past. Ethan stood in the middle of the now silent house, his fingers still gripping the faded newspaper article. His heart was pounding, his mind still trying to grasp the weight of what had just happened. But the longer he stood there, the more one truth became clear. The house wasn't haunted. It had been waiting for someone to do what his grandfather had failed to do. Waiting for a choice that would rewrite the past. And somehow that person had been him. For years, Ethan had felt nothing. Despite his success, despite his wealth, something had always been missing. He had thrown himself into his work, trying to ignore the emptiness that crept in at night. But now that feeling was gone. The house no longer felt like a shell, felt lived in. Even though Lillian and Nathan were no longer here, he could still feel their presence. Not as ghosts, but as something else. Something warmer. Something lighter. As if, for the first time, the house wasn't waiting anymore. It had finally let go. And for the first time in his life, so did Ethan. That night, Ethan didn't go back to his penthouse. He stayed in the townhouse. And instead of pouring himself a drink and staring out over the city like he usually did, he sat in the rocking chair in what used to be the nursery. He let himself breathe, let himself feel. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was alone. Not in a haunted way, not in a lingering, unfinished business kind of way, but in a way that felt whole. As if, finally, something had been set right. The next morning, Ethan found one last thing. A small, silver key on the nightstand. It wasn't his. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm. And then, beneath it, he saw a piece of paper. One sentence, written in neat, delicate handwriting. "Thank you for bringing us home." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He closed his fingers around the key. It didn't unlock anything in the house, but he still slipped it into his pocket, keeping it with him. Because even though they were gone, he would never forget. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Ethan's life. He still ran his company, still closed million-dollar deals. But something was different. He started taking time to actually live. He reached out to old friends. He visited his parents instead of just sending expensive gifts. And most importantly, he started looking for ways to help others, not just with money, but with time, because he had learned something that night. Sometimes, a single act of kindness doesn't just change someone else's life, changes your own. Months later, Ethan was walking through the city when the rain started to fall. People rushed for cover, pulling their jackets over their heads, ducking into doorways. But Ethan, he simply stood there for a moment, feeling the cold drops hit his skin. The memory of that night came rushing back. The rain, the woman, the baby, and the choice that had changed everything. As he turned to walk away, his fingers brushed against the small, silver key still in his pocket. And he smiled, because he finally understood. He hadn't just saved them, they had saved him too.